Hey everybody, it's Jay, and tonight I want to talk about a few custom katanas that I had made. Not really katanas, there's one katana, there's a Nodachi, and there's a Tanto, so there's two swords and a knife, effectively. I'm going to take the tack this time of talking about my experience in the custom Japanese-style sword realm. These are all going to be Chinese-made swords, and they come from two different sellers. I know a lot of people ask about people's experience with this seller and that seller and so on, so I thought it might be kind of useful, hopefully informative, hopefully a little bit entertaining, to talk about what my experience was through the buying process and as well as the final product that I received. I'm not really a historian. I'm very bad at remembering specific dates. I'm very bad at remembering specific details unless it's Lord of the Rings lore or Warhammer 40k lore for some inexplicable reason. I generally tend to have a little bit of a difficult time with some of those very specific details. So if I gloss over some things, if I get some things wrong, I do ask that you bear with me. To be honest with you, Japanese-style swords, particularly katanas, are probably the most exhaustively documented sword on the internet by a long shot. There's definitely a cult of personality, some earned, some not so, around the katana. So be sure to go check out some other videos from other people that actually know what they're talking about if you're interested in the history part of this. But to save some time, let's go ahead and start with the big boy here. Probably going to use a mix of Japanese and English terms for the sword components because, again, I'm not particularly well versed in it just yet. I'm not an expert in any way. Start with the big boy here. This is a Nodachi. This one is made by Swords of Northshire. At least I ordered it from Swords of Northshire. And I went with them because they're one of the few places that had a custom Nodachi available. And they also have a very good reputation, particularly with their Nodachis. So I figured I'd give them a shot. Also, if you're hearing that, I just realized I left the fan running, so if you're hearing that, here's a little background noise for you to help you sleep. It's hot under all these lights, so I'm running a fan and I sweat like a pig. The overall length of this is 52 inches. We have a blade length of 36 inches, and I measured it at about 3.4 pounds. Now that's without the saya, or scabbard, as you Baka Gaijin may call it. So that is sword only. And this one I had to make out of 1095 folded clay tempered steel. They even let you pick the Hamon pattern, which is this kind of wave thing. I don't know if you can see it. I can see a light shining on the camera lens. Maybe you can see it, maybe you can't. I don't know. It's a big long sword. This is considered a great sword. In fact, some part of Nodachi or Odachi, the terms are used, as far as I know, interchangeably, at least from what I read, is actually means great sword. And you can see we have a very, very long handle. This is entirely meant to be used two-handed, unlike the katana, which is intended to be used two-handed, but can be used one-handed. So, these were, from what I understand, probably a cavalry weapon. By that I mean anti-cavalry weapon, and they were extremely short-lived in the 14th century because if you need a bunch of dudes with real long weapons taking out dudes on horses, you can make a whole bunch of spears with a lot less time, effort, energy, and materials, and training for that matter, than you can with a very, very long sword. So I assume that that's why they fell out of favor relatively quickly compared to polearms, because polearms are a thing that existed. The biggest challenge for using this thing effectively is just the length. But I am very surprised that the weight is actually not bad. At 3.4 pounds, I can almost use this thing one-handed. I can very comfortably hold it one-handed. Wielding is tricky just because there's a lot here. There's a lot. It's a handful. So getting really good quick turns, quick reaction, quick changes on the strike is pretty difficult. Even two-handed, it's pretty difficult. Again, it's not intended to be used one-handed at all. And that's really the only drawback of it, because to be quite honest with you, This is actually my most powerful cutting sword that I have. Again, it's not as effective in terms of being able to control the blade because it's just so long. But from a power standpoint, it cuts extremely well. It's the easiest cutter that I've got on all the swords that I have, and I don't have a ton, but I have a few. So, and this is easily the best cutter that I've got. Edge alignment is very forgiving, which isn't, which is pretty typical of katanas in general, Japanese style swords. That has to do with the edge geometry. That has to do with the very rigid blade. And this one obviously is no exception. I mentioned the weight. We do have a pretty pronounced and thick spine on this, as we do on the other two, which I'm sure impacts the weight and handling a little bit as well. But it's a $550 sword for one that is, what did I say before, 52 inches long. So all things considered, for a $550 sword, pretty good price. One thing I do like is the sageo, which is this cord around here, which is used to loop onto a belt. It's really nicely made. It's got a really nice texture. Like, it's very stiff feeling, but it's not cheap. And it's really thick. Pretty nice. So the blade quality seems good. I have done my traditional, as is tradition with every sword that I get, accidental cutting of my cutting stand, wherein I whack the cutting stand as hard as I can because I'm really bad still at cutting practice and cutting test. But didn't have any chipping or rolling on the edge or anything like that. And also didn't have to sharpen this one. It came extremely sharp out of the box. It's got a really nice glassy smooth feel on the edge that you can tell really does want to bite. So I'm very impressed with this Nodachi from the Swords of the Northshire that I had customized in what I'm calling a Cthulhu daisho, which, again, I'm probably using the term daisho incorrectly. I'll talk a little bit about later on why I went with that in my use of the term daisho. So let me start with the sword that started this whole thing. My chair is going to creak a bunch. It's a cheap chair. Can't spend a lot of money on chairs when you're spending a lot of money on swords. This is a katana. Now this one I ordered through an eBay seller by the name of Sword Cabinet 007. Now if that sounds familiar, it's because they're also the seller that sold me my Zatoichi Shirasaya. I had some complaints about the usability of that sword, but one of the things that I did not complain about at all was the blade. So I actually reached out to them about getting a koshirai, which is basically a fitment, handle, all that stuff, tsuba, saya, for that sword to make it a little bit more usable, because in the saya configuration, the Shirasaya configuration, it's not particularly usable. And what they're like is like, oh yeah, we can just make you a whole new sword. And I was like, well, if I'm gonna have you make a whole new sword, let's make it this way. And so I went back and forth with them through eBay's messaging service. I sent them the pics of what I wanted, and they made me this katana. Now this katana is 1095 clay tempered. This is not a folded version, but it is clay tempered. We have a genuine hamon, which is the tempering line here, for those of you who don't know. Overall length 39.5 inches, blade length of 28.5, and it's 2.2 pounds. Weight, all of these weights, by the way, my dog's down there. All of these weights, by the way, are approximate. They're just what I measured on the scale. Hold on one second. My tripod is blocking her bed. Go to bed, dog. Okay. She was moving the tripod out of the way so she could get in. All of these weights and measures are approximate because I just got a scale and I went stood on it with the sword and then measured it with a measuring tape. But, and again, all of them are done without the saya on. So it is pretty decent feeling in the hand. The balance point on it, I'll show you point of balance. I should have done so on the Nodachi as well. But it's about the same on the Nodachi, to be quite honest, even with a much longer blade. It's pretty far forward of the pommel. One of the, of the guard here. One of the advantage of having that slightly blade-heavy sword is it does make for a good cutting sword, and my cutting tests with it were very good. Lucy, go lay down, dog. She keeps coming in and out of her crate and pushing. Every time she does, she pushes the tripod out of the way. Compared to the Pine Crane Daisho, which I think you can see on camera behind me, this does not handle nearly as well. The Pine Crane Daisho, or the Pine Crane Katana, I guess I should say, is a lot lighter feeling in the hand. It's a lot easier to maneuver. This one tends to want to twist, but I paid $290 for this katana. I paid, I think, $850 for the Pine Crane Katana behind me. So there's a pretty big price difference between these two swords. So for a sub $300 sword, I think this handles just fine. It's a good cutter. I can wield it one-handed or two-handed as you're intended to be used. And it's amazing to me how much smaller this thing feels after handling the Nodachi. But it seems to be pretty decently made. Again, whacked my cutting stand pretty good with it. I think I even may have taken some branches down with it as well. And cut some tatami. It did well on all of them without having to sharpen it. Now I will say that the edge on this one is not as good as the Swords of the Northshire edge on the Nodachi. It's got a few more rough spots on it that I noticed, but I didn't have to really polish that edge up. I didn't have to hone it. It cut generally pretty well. So yeah, the buying experience from that seller was generally pretty good. Like I said, really fast communication. The Nodachi took me about 2 months to get. Now, they had originally projected about 4 weeks from the time that I ordered it to the time that I'd get pictures of the final product to sign off on, and it took about twice that. That's okay. Right whenever I ordered it, it was right at the end of 2020. China, from what I understand from the news, not from them, was going through another wave of COVID. And so I'm sure that that impacted it, as well as it being just generally a very large sword. This sword here and the knife that I'm about to talk about took about 2 weeks, and turnaround time on all of them was shockingly fast. Like, I'd get the ship notification and then generally have it by the end of the week in 3 or 4 days from China to my front door. So I have no complaints from that standpoint. Shipping was just unbelievably fast on both of these, to be fair. The saya is nearly identical to the Nodachi, but even though they came from presumably 2 different places, the Sageo, which is this wrap again, I think I mentioned before, is really soft feeling, pretty thin. It doesn't feel nearly as nice overall. And again, that could be just a perception thing. It just doesn't feel as nice as the Swords of the Northshire. One interesting thing, though, and this is the same on all of them, like I said, the saya seems pretty identical between the katana and the Nodachi. There's this little plastic insert that I've seen them on a $70 Shinwa. I've seen them now on a $290 katana from eBay, and a $550 Nodachi from Swords of the Northshire has this little plastic insert, this gold plastic insert. I'll talk a little bit about why I think that is a little later on, but yeah, overall though, pretty well made. In general, no complaints. And then I'll grab the smallest of the 3. This is my Cthulhu Tonto Knife. I actually reached out originally about potentially having Sword Cabinet 007 make me a wakizashi, and they said we could make you a Tonto, and I was like, okay, cool, yeah, let's do that. I already had a wakizashi from my Pine Crane Daisho, which this is a traditional Daisho. Daisho normally is a samurai loadout, basically. A katana, which is a long sword, and a wakizashi, which is a short sword. I have heard that that can also include sometimes instead of a wakizashi, a Tonto. I don't know, I can't claim to the veracity of that. It's just what I've read, and who knows if that's accurate or not. I could even be misremembering. But normally this is what you would see on a typical samurai loadout, would be a daisho of a katana and wakizashi. What a daisho, from my understanding, and again, I could be getting this wrong, is it's basically a matched set, 2 swords, generally a long sword and a short sword, which also has something to do with the meaning of the word daisho, where the fittings match. So I'm calling this set of 3 that I have a Cthulhu daisho, even though, again, might not even be really a genuinely accurate term for that, but that's what I'm going to call it anyway. So the short sword for my version of a daisho for my custom swords is this Tonto Knife. Computer has gone to sleep. The Tonto is 1095 clay tempered as well, which is of course high carbon steel. It's a decent steel. 1095 is great. It works fine. Overall length is 20 inches. Blade length is 13 inches. And I weighed it at 1.1 pounds, and it seemed to be, might be some variance there. It seemed to really have weight fluctuations about as much as I do. Like with the katana, it's got this kind of battle wrap, which is really unique. I've not seen a battle wrap like this, but Sword Cabinet 007 did this kind of very narrow diamond on both the katana and this, which I actually think is kind of cool. For this one, I went with a much smaller suba or guard, just to kind of fit with the Tonto theme. So cutting on this one was pretty challenging initially. I was doing a lot of baseball batting where basically whenever the blade hits the bottle, it'll knock the bottle away instead of cutting through it. I was getting some surface level cuts, what we would consider to be lacerations on the bottles, but not getting really good cuts. At first, I thought that was because we have a fairly small cutting surface here in this knife and a fairly light blade compared to the other two, even though the thickness at the spine is the same. But after checking the edge, I realized the edge was pretty dull. It wasn't butter knife dull, but it was dull enough that I believe it was impacting the cutting ability. So I put a hone on it with work sharp. I don't know why I said that weird. With a work sharp, and that seemed to help a lot. That I was able to cut consistently, and I was able to actually very easily cut tatami with it, which I didn't think I'd be able to do with a knife. But I knew I had cut bottles really well with my kukuris, and then I've got some bowies that I've cut bottles with really well as well. So I figured with a nice edge that would resolve that issue, and it did. It cuts extremely well also. So I'll talk a little bit about the fittings and why I went with what I went with. And I'll also mention, again, that peculiar little plastic insert here in the saya. The saya is wood, just heavily lacquered wood. The paint job, again, even though they came from two different places, is nearly identical, and that little gold insert is identical on all three swords as well, 2 swords and a knife. Of course, I specifically requested these fittings, and the 2 different sellers were able to source them for me and add them. So my perception of getting a custom sword is you're not getting a custom sword from the standpoint of you're getting something that is bespoke, handmade, all fitted together from scratch, like you would expect something like some small forges to do that would probably cost far more than $550, like multiple thousands of dollars to get something like that. You're getting a mass-produced production sword that is assembled for you to your specifications. And I believe that's why all of these factories are able to get, or these forges are able to get all the same fittings, is because they all have probably shared sources of mass-produced materials. That's not a bad thing if the quality that comes out of that is good. And as far as I'm concerned, for $550 for this gigantic greatsword that's really nicely made, for sub $300 Katana and Tanto, which is mostly handmade, to be honest, is not bad. The quality is, the output and the quality for that price is good for what is a production sword, a mass-produced sword. So I don't have any complaints from a quality standpoint. I think that these work pretty well overall for that price. And I would recommend either Sword Cabinet 007, again, from my personal experience on eBay, or Swords of the Northshire if you want to stick with somebody that already has an established reputation. My experience was good. I know a lot of other people's experiences have also been good with Swords of the Northshire. Communication was excellent. A lot of times I would send an email over in the afternoon, and by nighttime I would have a response back. And I was a challenging customer. I had some issues that I had to work through on my side that they worked through with me, and were very forgiving, and I appreciate them for that. Some last minute changes and corrections and things like that. And they were really helpful. Bryce Ronquill is the person that I worked with. And I think that he's kind of their main point of contact over there for whoever is making the swords. So I don't have any complaints there. And I think, again, for the price, well worth it. Are they as nice as my $850 and $550 swords that I have behind me? No. They're not. They are not as light in the hand. They're not as nimble. The fit and finish is not as good. And of course, we have some hallmarks of these mass-produced parts that don't exist on the Dragon King swords behind me. But again, significant price difference. So you're trading a little bit of weight and a little bit of fit and finish for considerably less price. And that's you know, if that trade-off is worth it to you, then the trade-off is worth it to you. It's probably for most people, excuse me, most backyard cutters and such that are looking for a sword in that price range, you're probably going to be fine with these. So anyway, this is Jay. Hope you liked the video. Please click like if you did. Be sure to subscribe to us if you haven't already, and check out the link to our Patreon page. And the power just went out. Hello? Is somebody there? Okay.